It's a distinct honor to introduce a scholar and a teacher and a public intellectual of great distinction. Dr. Amir Hussain is professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on world religions, specializing in the study of Islam, especially in the North American context. He holds several degrees, including a PhD from the University of Toronto, where he's received a number of awards. From 2011 into this year, he has served as the editor for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which is the flagship journal for the study of religion in this country. Before coming to California in 1997, he taught courses in religious studies at several universities in Canada. He's active in academic groups such as the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion and the American Academy of Religion. He is on the editorial boards of 4 scholarly journals: the Journal of Religion, Conflict, and Peace, Contemporary Islam, Dynamics of Muslim Life, the Ethiopian Journal of Religious Studies, and Comparative Islamic Studies. He's also interested in areas such as religion and music, religion and literature, and religion and film. In 2008, he was appointed as a fellow for the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities. Dr. Hussain is the co-editor for the 4th edition of World Religions, the Western Traditions, and World Religions, Eastern Traditions, textbooks published in 2014 by Oxford University Press. He's also the co-editor for the 3rd edition of A Concise Introduction to World Religion, published by Oxford University Press in this year's. Prior to those books, he wrote an introduction to Islam for North Americans entitled Oil and Water, Two Faiths and One God, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through it, and it's just I can tell you it's a wonderful, very stimulating work. And in addition to these book publications, he's an author of over 50 book chapters and scholarly articles, and it's our great honor to have him close out the day. Well, I shouldn't say close out the day. There's a panel discussion after the break, but to be our speaker at the 4th session today. So let's welcome him.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I need that energy. You're like my students. I gave a lecture a couple of years ago at the Naval Academy, which was a great privilege, but went into the auditorium, 150 midshipmen, all in uniform, really stirring kind of sight. And I said, good evening. They all, 150 of them, good evening, sir. And I'm like, I can get used to this. There's something about that. And then, assalamu alaikum. I'm honored to talk with you this afternoon about issues of teaching Islam in the Christian college classroom. And the remarks I want to make here are offered in memory of John Stephen Paul. Some of you may know him. I had the privilege of working with John on the Lilly Fellows program. We did a conference at LMU in 2008. Unfortunately, he passed away a year later. And then just Thursday, we got the news that one of our colleagues in Islamic studies, Shahab Ahmed, a beautiful, beautiful scholar at Harvard, had passed away, and his funeral actually was yesterday. So for those of you that pray, if you could remember John and Shahab in your prayers. I self-identify as someone who's a Muslim. And so as a religious person, as a Muslim, I need to begin with thanks, because in the Quran, the word for unbelief, kufr, is very often contrasted with the word for thanks, shukr. And for me, the implication is clear, that the person who does not believe is the person who is not thankful. My thanks to Tal Howard for inviting me to be here, to Suzanne McCarran for all of her help with the arrangements, and to everyone at the Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College for hosting us, for all their hard work in making this conference happen. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here. I've taught for a decade in a Catholic university, and so, like Gabriel, I feel the need to begin with a confession. I was born in a Catholic missionary hospital in Pakistan, St. Raphael's, literally brought into the world at the hands of a nun, Sister Elizabeth. 50 years later, I find myself teaching at a Catholic university. Holy Mother Church has a way, I think, of bringing us all back to her bosom. So let me say a few things about me, and not because I think I'm particularly interesting or important, but I think my story is sort of interesting. You know, how does a Muslim end up teaching theology in a Jesuit university? I was born in Pakistan into a Sunni family, rudimentary sort of religious instruction, but we moved to Canada, to Toronto, when I was 4 years old. So I had no formal instruction in my own tradition until I was an adolescent. Had I stayed in Pakistan, I would have learned those things, you know, Arabic, Urdu, all those kinds of things in elementary school. We moved to Toronto in 1970, and all of a sudden I became a visible minority as well as a religious minority. You know, the Toronto that I grew up in is a place where you're isolated as a Pakistani Muslim. You know, far cry from the cosmopolitan city that Toronto is now. John Barber is a reporter for the Globe and Mail, a national newspaper in Canada. And he echoed the sentiments of many of his cohort when he wrote this about his experiences in Toronto. I grew up in a tidy, prosperous, narrow-minded town where Catholicism was considered exotic. My children are growing up in the most cosmopolitan city on earth, the same place. In 1970, when we moved to Toronto, there were less than 34,000 Muslims in all of Canada. The 2011 survey, the last one we have data for, counted over 1 million Muslims in Canada. So you see the shift. 1970, 34,000. 2011, over 1 million Muslims in Canada. So all this to say that my Islam was shaped by being in a minority context. And so you have to learn about the dominant tradition. You know, when you're part of the minority, you have to learn about the dominant tradition. The dominant tradition does not have to learn about you. It's great when they do, but they don't have to. You know. No idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I knew I didn't want to work in the factories that my parents worked in. Nothing wrong with factory work. You know, had a dad who worked at the Ford plant building trucks, had a mom who worked at a small factory making parts for cars. But working on the line made me realize that was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. You know. We're academics, so sometimes academics use, I'm saying this to the students, you know, complicated words. If you had told me when I was an undergraduate student that I would end up as a theology professor at a Catholic university in Los Angeles, I would have said, and it's a technical word, are you high? You know? Why? Why would I move to LA? Why would I go to a Catholic school? You know, I'm not Catholic, only Catholics go to Catholic schools. Theology, I'm not even sure I know what theology is. You know? I chose my undergraduate college, University College, the University of Toronto, precisely because it had no Christian religious affiliation. Some of the other colleges at the University of Toronto did. You had Victoria College, United Church, St. Mike's, Catholic, Trinity, Anglican, and so on. I came to the study of theology through English literature. I was a psych major with a minor in English literature. And I realized that you couldn't understand William Shakespeare or William Blake, take two different Williams, you know, their work without knowing the Bible. I'll never forget Professor Jerry Bentley, a great scholar of Blake, and in one of his classes he put up an image, Blake's Great Red Dragon, Woman Clothed with the Sun. I think it was the copy in the Tate Museum. There's two copies. There's one in the Tate Museum. There's one in the Brooklyn Museum. I think it was the one from the Tate. And he says, oh, by the way, you know, this is a drawing that Blake had made. It's based on Revelation 12. And, you know, I was not shy about putting up my hand when I didn't know something. And so I put up my hand and, you know, Professor Bentley, what's Revelation 12? And he said, oh, well, you know, the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, behold, I saw a great wonder in heaven, a woman with the moon at her feet, above her head, a crown of 12 stars. And I said, no, Professor Bentley, what's the book of Revelation? You know, I had no idea. And so he sort of explained, you know, Revelation, its place in the New Testament. This may either astound, annoy, disappoint some of you. I went home and started reading the New Testament from Revelation 12, which is a great place to start reading the New Testament. You know, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. If you open up the New Testament to Matthew's genealogy, forgive me, it's not an exciting, page-grabbing, you know, kind of opening. You go to Revelation 12, and it's like, there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought. The dragon and his angels fought. And I'm like, war in heaven? Wait, Michael, I know Michael the angel's in the Quran. How can the dragon have angels? wait, you tell me this lady's about to give birth and there's a dragon waiting to eat her baby? That's good storytelling, you know? For an adolescent, that's engaging literature. And so that was my introduction to the New Testament. You know, you start from Revelation. I got hooked, what can I say? You know, but in taking courses on the Bible, you know, and I was fortunate to work with Northrop Frye, phenomenal English professor at the University of Toronto. One of his courses was called, it's a famous course, The Mythological Framework of Western Culture. And it was about the time his book, The Great Code, he was working on that book, basically saying, look, if there's one book you need to understand Western civilization, not just literature, but art, music, culture, it's the Bible. You got to study the Bible, and so study the Bible. You know, as a Muslim, I thought, well, maybe I should learn about my own tradition. So that's where I started learning about it in a serious way. You know, I went to the mosque, I knew how to pray, did that kind of thing, but you know, there weren't the Islamic schools that there are today there. So my formal education as a Muslim really didn't happen until the university setting. At the university, my teachers about Islam were all Christian. You know, Jane McAuliffe, who's a Catholic, Michael Mamura, who's Anglican, Will Oxtoby, who's Presbyterian, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, United Church of Canada. You know, and of all of them, only Jane, thankfully, is still with us. And it was Jane McAuliffe who first got me interested in the Christians of the Middle East and got me to do a very different dissertation project than the one that I'd envisioned. I was really delighted. Jane had come to Toronto in about 1993 or so. Her first book, Quranic Christians, had just come out around that point. And that was a book, you know, very simply saying when the Quran talks about Christians, who's it talking about? Who are the Christians in the Quran? And so I was excited that she was going to be there because I wanted to do some work, interfaith dialogue, beginnings of Islam, when Islam comes into the world, who are the Christians that Muslims are in dialogue with? And Jane very kindly sat me down and said, I think that's a great dissertation topic. Your Arabic's not bad, you're going to have to work a little bit more, but you're going to have to learn Syriac because the Arabic text, or the text you're looking at from the Christian side are in Syriac, so you have to work on the Syriac. That'll take a couple of years. Then you'll have to go to the Middle East, and you know, these manuscripts you're looking at really aren't in libraries, they're in monasteries. So you have to make nice with the monks, because the monks aren't going to give it up, you know, until they know who you are. So that'll take a couple of years. Then you have to translate these texts, and that'll take a couple of years. So you can start writing your dissertation about 7 years from now. And then she pauses. Or you could start something today on Muslims in Canada, because there really isn't a lot of work on Muslims in Canada. And you won't have to learn Syriac. And I'm like, yeah, take that one. You know, I thank God every day for Jane McAuliffe. There, really sound advice there. But as I mentioned, I also had the extraordinary privilege of being mentored by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the greatest Canadian scholar of religion, certainly in the 20th century. Directed, founded, in fact, the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University in Montreal in 1951, got hired away to Harvard in 1964, where for 2 decades he directed the Center for the Study of World Religions. Then he moved back, he and his wife Muriel, to their native city, Toronto, which was my native city, until Wilfred's death in 2000. His ideas on Islam were shaped during the 6 years that he and Muriel lived in Lahore, the city of my birth, coincidentally, from 1940 to 46. It was fascinating. You know, I was born in Lahore, but I left when I was 4. You know, Wilfred lived there for 6 years. Does that make him more of a Pakistani, you know, than me? Really interesting questions of identity. Wilfred's Urdu was better than mine. My Urdu, like British English, is very much inflected by class. I come from a long line of very poor people, so my Urdu was sort of gutter snipe Urdu. Wilfred's Urdu was the proper Lucknow, Delhi Urdu, and I would talk to him in Urdu, and I wouldn't know that I was saying things that you did not say to your professors or people of a higher sort of status. Let's just say I spoke very crudely with him, but I had no idea. And of course, I would go back and talk to my mom about this, and she was horrified about, I mean, I was literally, without scandalizing this, I was literally dropping the F-bomb on my professor without knowing it, because of course, that's how you talked. You know, you didn't know that this was a bad word, this was just how working class folks talked. My mother sort of set me straight about, you know, what I was saying, but it's a fascinating kind of thing about what do you do with someone whose, you know, your native language is not their native language, but they're better at it than you are, and, you know, the class issues that come in, really fascinating kinds of things. But for Wilfred and Muriel, it was really interesting because they wanted, in 1940, to study Islam, and so they went to India, which before partition, you know, was the country with the most Muslims. Now it's Indonesia that's the country with the most Muslims. In 1940, India was the country with the most Muslims. Even now, with partition of India and Pakistan, India is still probably the third largest population of Muslims, even though they're about 10% of the population. You know, and that was revolutionary. You know, go live with Muslims, study Muslims, but that's what you do when you're in a minority. You have to learn about the majority. That's what Wilfrid did, went to India to learn about Islam. They returned to Lahore in 1948, which, if you know your history, after the forced migrations, the massacres of partition the year before, had become the capital city of Pakistan, the new country. And it was there, in the ruins of Lahore. And conservative estimates are 500,000 people, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, butchered each other. You know, that's the conservative estimate over that time period. How do we deal with this? And in the ruins of Lahore, one of Wilfrid's compilers, Ken Cracknell, described his calling, and I'm quoting here, so as to help men and women understand each other, that religion should never again be used as an excuse for such bloodshed and such destruction. So the new trend towards engaged scholarship is not new to me. This is what my teacher was doing in 1948. But let me be clear here. You know, we're primarily here in the university for the pursuit of truth, not simply to do good works. In 1981, Wilfrid wrote a collection of essays about Islam, and he wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I, as an intellectual in the modern world, have always as my primary obligation and final commitment my loyalty to truth, subject to test at the hands of my fellow intellectuals, who constitute, of course, the primary audience of every thesis proceeding out of a university. I've developed a view," he continues, however, and articulated elsewhere at some length, that the arguments of a student of religion or of a particular religious or indeed any human community should in principle be persuasive to other intellectuals, not only, but in addition also to intelligent and alert members of the group or groups about which he or she writes. That's important. Do we recognize each other in our teaching? When I teach about Christianity, is it something that my Christian students would recognize? Or do I compare the ideals of my own tradition with the realities of another? You know, that's always an interesting thing. Is it ideals and realities? Is it apples to apples, or is it apples to oranges? You know? We Muslims and you Christians are neighbors to each other. And that's a very important metaphor, and I use that in my work, being a neighbor. Someone very famously once asked Wilfrid, "Professor Smith, are you Christian?" And if the question had been, "Are you a Christian?" his answer would have been very simple, yes, and Presbyterian, ordained minister. But the question wasn't, "Are you a Christian?" The question was, "Are you Christian?" And Wilfrid did what he always did when someone asked him a question. He took it seriously. He paused. He thought about it. Repeated the question. Am I Christian? Maybe. Last Tuesday, at lunchtime, for about an hour. But if you really want to know, ask my neighbor. Profound. Am I Christian? Ask the person beside me, how do I behave? How do I live in the world? Am I living as a Christian? You know? Unfortunately, there's so many Muslims in North America and around the world who have no interest in pluralism, in the kind of dialogue that we're doing here. You know, they see Islam as the only true religion, often see their own particular ways of being Muslim, and that's something we can talk about in the panel discussion, because many of us who teach at schools where we have Muslim students encounter those kinds of issues. What do you do, not between Christian and Muslim students, but among Muslim students? You know, the difference is there. And I have Muslim students who are often such zealous defenders of Islam. And in hearing their rhetoric of intolerance, I think back to Wilfrid, who for many of us who study religion was the paradigm of critical scholarship. You know, no text by Wilfrid had less than a third footnotes. You know, that's scholarly stuff. His command of languages was phenomenal. You know, there's a very famous note in Towards a World Theology, where he apologizes for not being able to read literary Tibetan and has to rely on translations. But everything else, including, you know, the Hebrew, the Arabic, the Persian, the Japanese, and the Chinese is his own translation. You know, people like that are astounding. We can talk about that more. It's accidents of history and geography, but also these amazing skill sets. So, paradigm of critical scholarship but he was able to offer critique when it was needed. Wilford wasn't a Muslim, he was a Christian. He was not an apologist for Islam, yet his critique never did violence to what it meant for other people to be Muslim. In Islam and Modern History, written in 1957, he wrote the following: "A true Muslim, however, is not a man who believes in Islam, especially Islam in history, but one who believes in God and is committed to the revelation through his prophet." That was 57. In 1962, over 50 years ago, in The Meaning and End of Religion, probably his most famous book, he continued, I'm quoting here, "The essential tragedy of the modern Islamic world is the degree to which Muslims, instead of giving their allegiance to God, have been giving it to something called Islam." I love that. "The essential tragedy of the modern Islamic world is the degree to which Muslims, instead of giving their allegiance to God, have been giving it to something called Islam." Those words could have been written yesterday, in the age of ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, with equal force and validity. What can we do? Perhaps in the future, we as Muslims can help you as Christians with a new approach to evangelization. Not to change each other's religions, but to help each other find what is meaningful in our own traditions, to spread the message of the gospel, to literally evangelize, working together for common goals, which I think we all share. I'd be happy as a Muslim to live in a land where the ethical teaching was the teaching of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know of such a place in Christian or Muslim lands, but perhaps that's one of those things we can construct together. We can be seen in conflict and competition with each other, and we've both been in conflict and in competition with each other in our present and in our history as Christians and as Muslims. The Great Commission for you as Christians, the Quranic teaching on dawah, calling people to Islam for us as Muslims, certainly are in competition. It's no surprise that we're the two largest religious traditions in the world, Christianity, then Islam. You go out there and you make converts of people. But we can also be in cooperation with each other, being in what the Catholic Church describes as a culture of dialogue. And I've learned the most about this, Catholic perspectives on dialogue, from my friend and Jesuit colleague, Father Tom Michel. Tom is the Jesuit who's done the most work by far on interfaith dialogue with Muslims. And about this, the culture of dialogue, Tom wrote, and I'm quoting here, "The focal question is not whether the Church should be proclaiming the gospel or engaged in dialogue, but rather whether Christians are actually sharing life with their neighbors of other faiths. The basic distinction is not between being a church in dialogue or one that proclaims the gospel, but rather the option of being a church that is following the Spirit's lead to partake humanly in life with others, and thus constantly engage in dialogue, witness, and proclamation. Or else being a church that is closed in on itself and exists in a self-imposed ghetto, with little concern for and involvement with people of other faiths with whom Christians share culture, history, citizenship, and common human destiny." And Tom continues, "When people of various faiths live together, not simply cohabiting the same town, but sharing life together, the question of dialogue or proclamation doesn't arise. When they work, study, struggle, celebrate, mourn together, and face the universal crises of injustice, illness, and death as one, they don't spend most of their time talking about doctrine. Their focus is on immediate concerns of survival, on taking care of the sick and the needy, on communicating cherished values to new generations, on resolving problems and tensions in productive rather than in destructive ways, on reconciling after conflicts, on seeking to build a more just, humane, and dignified society." So there are any number of trajectories for teaching about Islam in a Christian setting. And we can talk about them in the question and answer period. We can talk about them in the panel discussion, because the four of us who've presented have brought really different perspectives and things, and a lot of stuff we share. We could talk, for example, for me, pre-9/11, I would start my course on Islam with a standard historical introduction to Muhammad and the early Muslim community. A book, Frank Peters' book, Muhammad and the Origins of Islam. Frank was a great, retired from NYU, great, secular, critical historian. What do we know about Muhammad and the origins of Islam? Secular, critical, historical perspective. I did that because my Muslim students and my non-Muslim students pre-9/11 knew almost nothing about Islam. So you start with that. Post 9/11, everyone came in thinking they knew something about Islam, but almost everything they knew was wrong because they got it from the media. So you have to start thinking about media and images. So now, I mentioned I teach a freshman class on Islam in America. The first book that they're reading, and they better be reading because I have a book review due on Thursday, Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. You know, Neil was a communications theorist, also at NYU. It's essentially like a Marshall McLuhan light. As a Canadian, I have to advance the ideas of other Canadian scholars, and so McLuhan was one of our great ones there. And really great, thinking about, you know, medium as the message, metaphors, typography, you know, what makes a good argument in print, makes deathly boring television, you know, how we shift from the print to the oral, from the oral to the visual. Culture there, and that's crucial to start talking with the students about this. And it's great because Neil's book was written in 1985, you know, a decade before the students were born, you know. But it's fascinating how relevant it is today. Amusing Ourselves to Death is the title there. When we do any kind of comparative study of religion, we have to make sure that we have our categories correct. Wilford, again, wrote, for example, not only on connection between the Bible and the Quran, but more properly between Jesus for Christians and the Quran for Muslims. You know, the Word made flesh, the Word made book. You know, or theology for Muslims and philosophy of religion for Christians. You know, what we as Muslims know as kalam, theology, really isn't what you as Christians know as theology. It's really philosophy of religion. You know, or the Christian concept of the Spirit and the Quranic notion of God. Al-Hadi. Al-Hadi is one of the names of God, the guide. You know, the Quran talks about the Spirit of God, but Wilford said, you know, that's not the important comparison. The important comparison really is, and he's writing as a Christian, that, you know, the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit of God, is really more like the notion of God as guide, God who continues to work in the world. You know. So do we have our categories correct? I don't want to get into discussions of the Trinity, mostly because whenever I think I understand the concept, you pull the ground out from under my feet. I'm really serious about this. I think you guys being Christians, do this just to annoy me. You know, because it's just, I had a discussion the other day with one of my Jesuit colleagues who talked about, you know, the Trinity being non-hierarchical and co-equal. And I'm like, wait a minute. Father and Son, by definition, those are hierarchical terms, you know. Orthodox notion of monarchy of the Father, rejection of filioque clause, but I'll take your word for it, you know. You tell me it's non-hierarchical, you tell me that it's co-equal, I get it. Well, I don't get it, but it's a mystery, you know. What I do find useful, though, and I'm joking, well, I'm not joking about it being a mystery, I think it is a mystery, but what I do find useful is David Burrell, you know, a wonderful theologian who used to teach Professor Reynolds, does now at Notre Dame. Wonderful, wonderful teacher, Holy Cross priest. And in a 2012 collection from Fordham called Christian Lives Given to the Study of Islam. I'd recommend that book to you, by the way. Really interesting collection, C.T. Hewer, Christian Troll, editors of that work. Christian Lives Given to the Study of Islam. It's a story of about 30 people, all of whom are Christians from various Christian denominations, just basically saying, you know, why would a Christian become a scholar, an expert in Islam? And David is one of those folks. And David talks about exactly the question that's come up here about the Great Commandment and the Shema. That what does it mean that when Jesus is asked, you know, what's the Great Commandment? And Gabriel talked about this in, you know, Mark 12. What's he do? But as a good Jewish boy, recite the words of the Shema. You know, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You know, that, especially in the Hebrew, you know, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Eloheinu, Ahad. Sounds very close to my Kul Hu Allahu Ahad, you know, say God is one. So we're talking about, you know, it's not, and I say this to my Muslim friends, that the Trinity, and unfortunately, you know this better than I do. Many Muslims completely misunderstand that and think the Trinity means three gods. You know, the Trinity is many things. Three gods is not one of them. You know, there's a fundamental unicity here. There's one and only one God, but in three forms. Very different for us as Muslims. Not the one God part. That's the same, but how that God is understood. Or to take the other example, what we as Muslims do to you as Christians is kind of what you as Christians do to Jews. What I mean by that is the Hebrew Bible read very differently by Jews and by Christians. Christians, I would posit, read what they call the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, or at least through the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's the prism for understanding the Hebrew Bible text. Jews read it quite differently. We do the same thing. We Muslims read the New Testament, or for that matter, the Bible, New and Old Testaments, through the lens of the Quran. No surprise. We sort of find things that agree with us, and we find things that completely disagree with us, because we're using our criterion, the Quran, to read your book in exactly the same way. And I understand that it's your book, meaning the Hebrew Bible is the first half of your text, but it's this really interesting thing. How are those texts read by Jews and by Christians? Muslims, and I always make this point to Muslim students, need to understand both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Not just, as Professor Northrop Frye said, to know about the Western world, but we need that to be able to understand the Quran. I would argue that the Quran makes no sense unless you know the biblical stories. Clearly, the first hearers of the Quran knew some of these stories. So, for example, chapter 5 of the Quran, chapter 5, verse 27, begins with this line, "Recite to them in truth the story of the two sons of Adam." Quran doesn't say, here's Adam's story, here are the two sons of Adam, here's the story of the two sons of Adam. The Quran assumes that people know the story of Adam and the two sons. It tells what it considers to be the meaning of that story. It doesn't explain the characters. You have to know those texts to understand those texts, meaning the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, to understand the Quran. And so I always make that plea to Muslim students to become more familiar with biblical texts. On the Christian side, many North Americans are surprised to learn that Muslims have a long history on their continent. At least 10% of the West African slaves that were brought here were Muslim. Thomas Jefferson began learning Arabic in the 1770s after he purchased a translation of the Quran in 1765. It was that Quran that Keith Ellison, when he was sworn in as the first Muslim member of Congress in 2007, was sworn in on in a private ceremony. Given Ben Carson's comments the other night about Muslims not being fit to be, I don't know the exact phrase I was flying at the time, whether it was Muslims aren't fit or Muslims can't be, president of the United States. Really interesting kind of thing. You want to say, go back to Mr. Jefferson, Look at the Statute of Religious Freedoms in Virginia. Really interesting. Jefferson didn't like Muslims. Jefferson didn't like Islam. But even Muslims would have the benefit of religious freedom in Mr. Jefferson's Virginia. It's sort of fascinating in Mr. Carson's America in the 21st century, where we fit in there. We've got about 6 to 7 million Muslims in the US. Very distinct, different groups. About a third of us are South Asian, people like me from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. At least a quarter of us are African American. A third of us are Middle Eastern. And Middle Eastern, especially in LA, where I'm from, Iranian, Egyptian, Iraqi, all sorts of mixes. We're a very old community, but a very new one. We've only been here in significant numbers, really, since the late 60s. For me as a kid growing up, I had very few Muslim role models that I saw on television. The ones that I had were two athletes, the greatest, Ali. And it's kind of fascinating, because when Muhammad Ali refused induction to the Vietnam War in 1967, it was very clearly as a Muslim. Now he's sort of like this kindly old man. We don't pay attention to his Muslimness, even though he's still very much a Muslim. And my basketball hero, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who converts when he's at UCLA, not Lou Alcindor, the Catholic anymore, but Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the Muslim. For my students, it's the same these days, except it may not be athletes, but entertainers. Dave Chappelle is a Muslim. Hip-hop artists. I know the Gordon College crowd, you probably listen to a lot of gangster rap. Ice Cube is a Muslim. Wu-Tang, RZA is a Muslim. Lupe Fiasco is a Muslim. Really interesting. So if you saw, for example, and it's kind of interesting because where we live in Los Angeles, Straight Outta Compton, the film over the summer about NWA, Ice Cube, one of the guys in NWA, becomes a Muslim. He's got a great line, and so I smile as I say this. Listen to Gangster Rap Made Me Do It by Ice Cube. And when you play it in your dorm and someone says, why are you playing that? Just say, because the Muslim professor told me to play it. There's a great line where Ice Cube talks about, he and Allah being homies. Really interesting, like I'd never heard of anyone calling Allah his homie until Gangster Rap Made Me Do It. Really interesting sort of things there. So connections with Muslims. And I'll sort of finish up here that we, at my university, which is a Jesuit university, other Jesuit, other Catholic universities, other Christian universities may welcome Muslim students. Others may have a faith statement. I've been at places like Gordon or Messiah College where you have to sign a faith statement in order to be there. And I think those are perfectly fine. I completely agree with Jennifer there. I don't see any issues there. So you may have a school in which you don't have Muslim students or faculty. You may have a school where you have Muslim students or faculty. We at LMU, Jesuit Catholic University, but only about half our students are Catholic. We have about 6,000 students. About 300 of them are Jewish. We've got a very active Hillel on campus. About 200 are Muslims. We've got about 200 Muslim students on campus, half of whom are American students, half of whom are international students, who've come to study there. And our past president, Father Bob Lawton, spoke of the value that these students, non-Catholics, including not just other Christians, but members of other religious traditions as well as atheists, have in our university. 2008's Mass of the Holy Spirit, the Mass of the Holy Spirit is the traditional kickoff to our school year. Father Lawton said this in his homily: non-Catholics, non-believers are not here at the university simply because we need you to pay our bills or raise our grades or our SAT scores. We want you here for a deeper reason. By helping us to doubt, you help us to get closer to a deeper understanding of our God, this life, and the world we share. It's a really important statement for Father Lawton to make. Do we recruit Muslim students because they can pay our outrageous tuition? No. Do we recruit Muslim students because they're smart and they raise our scores and our profiles and our rankings and this? No. We bring them in because it's important to bring them in as people who by definition are not Christian. That's the place there to understand. You, the members of Christian colleges, can help us, Muslim students, become much more visible as individuals, as community participants in North American life. We can encourage our children to value arts and humanities. I joke, but it's serious. Muslim mothers or Jewish mothers. There's 4 careers you can have: doctor, lawyer, engineer, business owner, and there is no 5th option. My sister's the engineer. She's the one that my mother loves better than I, because I'm not the doctor. And I tell her, but Mom, I have a PhD. I am a doctor. It's like, no, a real doctor. The kind that helps people, and it was just, it's that kind of battle. But, whenever I speak to Muslim students, or Muslim parents, I say to them, look, cover your ears, because you're not going to like what I have to say. We have enough Muslim doctors, lawyers, engineers. We're the artists. We're the writers. We're the journalists. We're the poets. We're the storytellers. We have to encourage our kids to be involved in the humanities, to tell our stories. Because if we don't tell our stories, other folks are all too willing to tell those stories for us. A couple of more things to say there, but let me sort of stop at this point. I'm just looking at the clock, realizing I've gone on a little longer than I wanted to, and my students are very good at telling me that I'm actually kind of interesting for about half an hour. After half an hour, I start to lose, the touch with them. So let me stop there, because there's a lot more we can talk about, and hopefully perhaps in the discussion, and then certainly in the panel discussion that follows afterwards, we can say a little bit more about these. Because literally, all 4 of us, I think, could spend the whole day talking about some of these issues of what does it mean to teach about Islam in a Christian college setting. So let me stop there.